Welcome, everyone, and to all of our ISM members, chapter partners, and our guest to today's program hosted by ISM New Jersey. Our speaker today is Jane Tierney, who will be speaking on, Oh, what a tangled web we weave, the globalization network of supply chains today. And Jane is an expert in supply chains. Please be sure to ask any questions by using the chat or the Q&A function. We will be recording this presentation and we'll be sending the link out later today with your CEH credit. Now on to our presentation. Jane is the founder of her company, purplelink, sharing with clients a better way to obtain value through the supply chain. Jane is an engineer with an MBA, a Greenbelt, CPSM, and CPSD certifications. In addition to running her business, she teaches operations and supply chain management courses in the California State University system and serves on the advisory board for the Operations and Supply Chain Management Program. In 2020, she co-founded the Southern California Supply Chain Risk Management Council for Local Executives, which hosts an annual supply chain risk symposium. Jane is a speaker. She's also an author. She offers bi-monthly dynamic dialogue webinars and conducts workshops on a variety of topics. At this time, I'd like to turn the program over to Jane.
Thanks, Kathy, and thank you to ISM New Jersey for hosting these great events. I'm happy to be part of that. And as Kathy said, today I'm going to talk about supply chains. When we say, oh, what a tangled web we weave, we're going to talk about the intersection, how these supply chains kind of got to where they are, why they're so convoluted, and why they have tentacles that kind of circle the earth. So first, a little bit about me. Kathy told you a lot about that. I've been in operations and supply chain for a long time, longer than I care to admit. So I say that I've been a consultant since 2015. I do a lot of work with my clients on assurance of supply, program management, process improvements, always reductions of cost. And that includes inventory, scrap, waste, lots of things. I do have a green belt and I'm a big proponent of metrics, KPIs, if you know that, key performance indicators, and then OKRs. So these are objectives and key results from John Doerr's book, Measure What Matters. So I'm happy to be here today, and I'm going to give you a little history of some supply chains and talk about how we are so interwoven today in this global mesh of that. So I'm going to talk about the evolution of supply chains, give you some examples of goods and products and materials where that source is in the world. Talk about why it's so hard to change from where we are after we look at how we've evolved to this point. Talk about some of the options, and then I'm going to give away some prizes. So I'm going to have a raffle at the end. So if you want to participate in that, what you need to do is to send me an email to jane@purplelink.co. Just send your email, just put ISM New Jersey or webinar or something like that in the subject. And at the end of the presentation, I'll give away an Amazon gift card. So here we go. Let's talk about some supply chain milestones. I know if you're part of ISM, then you're probably familiar with the procurement end of things and the buying end of things. So supply chain, as we know, covers everything from sourcing to operations to distribution and logistics, order fulfillment, which includes production, planning, all the logistics, scheduling and everything, as well as procurement. But in terms of supply chain, especially kind of bent toward procurement, let's look at what happened. Before 1900 or early 1900s is where we really saw the first semi-trucks invented. They came in at the end of the 19th century. Mack Trucks was actually founded in about 1900. And that's one of those terms that we hear, you know, built like a Mack truck. That's because those trucks were heavy, beefy, and they've been around for over 100 years, which is not anything that I was aware of. But they are, and they're still here. Diesel engines that we all are familiar with came in about the mid-1920s, And forklifts, the very first forklifts, weren't even around until the 1930s. Pallets storage usage really started about 1925. And if you can think about a warehouse in a world without pallets, that is like kind of mind-blowing. So that changed the way we store things across the globe very drastically. A complete change in how storage was conducted with pallets and with forklifts to move those around. In the 1950s, we started using standardized containers, the kind of big boxes that can be used on rail cars, trucks, boats. And there's nothing like seeing one of the shipyards. I happen to live in Los Angeles, and we have two very large ports here, the Port of LA, Los Angeles, and the Port of Long Beach, that are side by side, and together they, well, independently, they're very large and significantly in the world, but together they're one of the top combined ports on the globe. So, and if I've had the opportunity to take a couple of tours down there, and it's kind of mind-boggling to see how many of those containers get picked up and moved around from place to place all day, every day. If you live on the coast like I do too, you see these boats out there stacked sky high with these containers. But that didn't come around, those standardized containers, till about the 1950s. And of course, in the 1950s, a lot of what we saw was that those were on rail cars, and it was easy to pick them up from one rail line to another. Well, not easy, but it was easier than trying to move all of the stuff from one container, one car into another. And so that's really morphed over the last half century. In the 60s and 80s, we saw more pallets, handling equipment, the standardized containers that I just mentioned made shipping more reliable. Deliveries were therefore more predictable. You could actually put procedures and processes in place. The shipping that you could do more quickly allowed for shipping more produce, raw materials, parts, products over longer distances and quicker times. My mother used to tell me that she was like blown away because you could get like strawberries year round. And when she was a kid, everything was so seasonal. And now we don't really recognize the seasonality of a lot of things, because you go to the grocery store, and if you want strawberries, you can pretty much get them any time of the year. They don't all come from local growers, but they're more and more available thanks to a lot of the logistics. Well, I don't know what happened there. Sorry about that. So we've had a lot of changes in that kind of stuff. Computers were introduced in about 1967. IBM had an inventory management and forecasting system that came in that started to revolutionize how we do a lot of the planning and how we do a lot of the buying. We had coordination of tracking of the orders, the inventory, distribution. All of that was on that IBM that took up a whole room and had to be climate controlled and lots of things. But that really got away from a lot of the what we now call spreadsheets that were all done manually by hand and all that kind of thing. So it was a way different world back then. So we've come a long way. We also, into the 80s and the 90s, we have things that have popped in. And the term supply chain management itself wasn't really used until 1983. That was about the time that companies started putting personal computers into the workplace. I know when I first started using personal computers, it was in the 80s, and we had small, well, they weren't small by that time, they were standard, but it was the old Apple kinds of things and spreadsheets were a big deal. I was working as an engineer at the time, and the spreadsheets were huge. So that really made our lives a lot better, being able to do that kind of stuff. But they were tiny screens, and I remember sharing computers with 3, 4, or even the whole department. You didn't get on the computer and spend all day like we do today. Spreadsheets revolutionized the tracking of costs and parts, and let companies really look at how to maximize profits and optimize freight routes, which was a big change. Personal computers and multiple computer terminals, they changed a lot of the way things worked. I remember the green screens and computer rooms. Probably some of you do too. If not, you should research it because it's an interesting thing, and it wasn't all that long ago. MRP and ERP systems, those terms were coined, and those systems were installed into many companies, beginning with larger companies that wanted that kind of power, and companies that wanted market expansion past the US into Canada and Europe primarily. And then in the 80s and 90s, primarily into the 90s, we were galloping into Asia to set up sales offices, followed by agreements with local manufacturing resources to try to get cheap labor, and then establishment of corporate-owned manufacturing sites. I worked with some large companies, and we had a lot of expats that we had that volunteered to go to different places in Asia, Singapore, Malaysia, eventually China, for a year or two. They took their families, they went over, they worked in the country, they were senior executives in those companies, setting them up and getting them ready to go. So a lot of changes in the last 25 years. So people having that opportunity to live abroad and work abroad and bringing those other brands into the companies, that was a big deal. So what we found that we impacted the supply chains quite a bit. In the 90s, we saw that corporations were focused on key businesses. Many businesses in the 1980s adopted a conglomerate strategy. So they were buying all kinds of businesses. And the idea was, if you had a diverse portfolio of companies within your large corporation, you were more likely to be successful. I worked for ITT for a while, not in the 80s, but during the 80s, they owned things like Hartford Insurance, Sheraton Hotels, the Madison Square Garden. They owned ITT Technical Institute. That's where that started. It was actually a part of ITT itself. So that grew into there. And so they had all of these different, and jacuzzi tubs. So they had all of these different businesses, as well as their kind of traditional things, because in the 80s, they bought all of these. And then in the 90s, they said, you know what, this isn't working, because you might be a great executive at Sheraton Hotels, but that doesn't mean you know anything about the insurance business. If you're Hartford Insurance or managing one of the defense contract things that I worked with when I was part of ITT, and Madison Square Garden was a whole different animal to do. So corporations decided that wasn't good. And that was the era of Jack Welch in the 1990s. And his philosophy at one point was either be number one or number two in the marketplace or get out. So all of these consolidated things now started getting broken apart and sold off in pieces. And that created a lot of competition and a lot of different kinds of competition than companies had seen before. And then in the 80s and really in the 90s, in my experience, is when I started working with that. I was working for HP at the time, and that's when outsourcing became popular and companies were really looking at that. Before that, there were a lot of companies that were and corporations pretty horizontally integrated. They did a lot of things in-house, and they had different plants in different places that made parts and did things. And the outsourcing really started to make that much more vertical integration. There were a lot of tech transfers to suppliers and international sites, again, to take care to address raising labor costs. And so you could get cheap labor in Asia. My first foray into international sourcing was with Singapore. And within about a year or two, when I started working with them, we said, Singapore is getting too expensive. We need to go to other places in Asia. So then we went to Malaysia, we went to Thailand, and within about another couple of years, we were into China. So China opened up, but China didn't really open up as early as some of the other places in Asia. So like I said, I was doing business in Malaysia and Singapore. Japan had been a big place to do things, but that really started a little bit later. And companies were rushing to establish footholds in Asia, not only because they could take advantage of inexpensive labor, but because the markets were opening up, and those companies and those countries and their governments were starting to really want to attract American brands and American companies and corporations. So these global supply chains started growing these tentacles all over the place. And you can see kind of how this worked. The material suppliers, component suppliers went kind of everywhere. The demand started getting bigger and bigger and started morphing all over the place. So China was opening up about the late 90s. And that started going after the first of the year. And what you kind of end up with is something that looks like this, which is really indecipherable about what's there. You've got all of these different things. People are throwing out all these words like collaboration. They're worried about pricing. They're looking at opportunities. We're talking about regulations and complexities and value add kinds of things and all kinds of different things. And companies did not really plan this well. It really kind of evolved and morphed into what it is. So here are some of the drivers, and here's kind of how we got to where we are. A couple of things really drove this. Looking at the cheap labor was one, access to additional resources was another, and then access to markets in these areas with these burgeoning populations. So if we look at it today, 40% of the world's population is between China and India. If you don't know this, we just passed 8 billion people on this planet a few months ago. And in May, India actually passed China as the most populous country on the planet. So, but between them, there's 40% of the world's population. You have, and I'll show you a little bit about that in a second, but you have India, China, and then the US. So India and China are both about 1.4 billion. And then we go to the US, which is 350 million. So markedly smaller, but these companies that have been here and that we're familiar with, you think about car companies, companies like GE, a lot of other companies needed places to expand to. And with the population in Asia, they had to go there. It was bound to happen. So they're looking for resources in technology, but we're also looking for materials. We're looking for minerals and metals and different things. But in order to work that, and even to make these expat and these remote sites work, these expat assignments, and to build facilities in Singapore, in China, in Thailand, whatever, you needed an educated workforce. So you needed to find a city or a town or a country, all of the above, that had a workforce that was educated to the level where it would provide the resources that you need to get that plant built up and make it successful. And of course, labor, labor, labor. So we were looking at lower labor rates, which was easy to find in Asia. And the lower overheads on the plant and the plant expenses themselves, the land prices and the building prices and everything were not as high as they were in the United States. And we had some pretty significant periods of inflation in there in the late 70s, which drove a lot of companies to look for alternatives, and companies worried about repeating that. So how could they get away from that? So all of those things kind of work together. And you see, we just kind of went everywhere and anywhere across the globe trying to do that. So some of the outsourced locations that corporations used initially, they went to Mexico. So that was a close thing to do. Mexico was close. It was available. It was easy to ship things back and forth. They were open to trade. And there were some pockets of good technology and things like that. Places like Guadalajara. I worked in and lived in San Diego for a lot of years. And we saw the maquiladoras, that we call them, just kind of up here. So you could go across the border and you could do a lot of business pretty easily. It was easy to get back and forth across the border and get cheaper labor and things like that. Singapore, again, that's where I started doing a lot of things. And Japan too, because Japan had things like Deming, who had been there for a long time. Toyota, Honda had started to come into the market here in the United States a lot to look at building up the cars. But the first Hondas and Toyotas that were sold in the United States were not considered the quality that they have today. So they have quite a road to go there, but they've climbed that. And at one time, Toyota actually exceeded GM as the largest car company, but I think it's back to GM being on top. Then we started going into companies like China, India, and Taiwan. A lot of different things pulled that. India and Taiwan. India had some pulls because it very English speaking country, and of course it had a long history being associated with the British Empire. It was not part of the British Empire then, and it hasn't been for a while, but they still speak English a lot. Taiwan is interesting because China and Taiwan are not the best of friends, but Taiwan was an easy place to get into to do some business, and so that started growing. Eastern Europe became more popular in the late 90s and even into the early 2000s because there was, after the Cold War broke and there were a lot of things, these countries were looking for additional business. It was close to European markets and it was attractive to that because their currency was different. They still don't all use the euro, if you don't know that. A lot of those countries have their own currency still, and that can be a good exchange rate if you're trying to handle the European market, which can be a kind of an ugly exchange rate. So that was a big pull, and there was talented resources there too, and close to some different minerals and things that we'll look at. And now we're going to Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, in even more into those kind of countries. Bangladesh is another one, and they need the commerce, they need that. So, who knows where we're going to go next? There's Brazil is attracting some. There's some issues with going to South America, political, as you know, geopolitical kinds of things, but a lot of political unrest and things. But that's burgeoning. Brazil, because it is so populous compared to some of the other countries there. And Africa, of course, is another area that some pundits are predicting is going to be the next low-cost manufacturing site. So we'll see what happens, but you can be pretty sure that it's going to keep changing. Let's see if we can move. There we go. Some of the enablers for this. In 1992, the U.S.-China relations really opened. That was under the George H.W. Bush meeting with Premier Li Peng during a UN conference. And then in 2000, President Clinton granted China permanent normal trade relations. So that was a big deal. The 92 thing, before 92, US and China were not even really talking. And then in 92 is when Bill Clinton was elected in that fall, November. And then at the end of his 2 terms, he granted China the normal trade relations. So that was in 2000s, which people think we've been going to China for 30, 40 years, and that's not really true. It's even when that started in 2000, it wasn't until like the mid 2005 and things that a lot of companies actually wanted to go to China and were setting things up. So really in the last 20 years, you've seen a lot of the migration into China to try to take advantage of the labor and the number of people there. India had good trade relations, and as part of the British Empire, a lot of those trade treaties and agreements were in place. And then there were more and more trade agreements that were put in place, and they were in the PAC type thing. So the Asia PAC treaties were put together to facilitate trade, and there was a lot of political effort to foster trade and open up trade between a lot of these companies. So logistics, which was a big part of this. I mean, it doesn't matter if you can get a cheap factory in Antarctica. If you can't get the goods from Antarctica anywhere else, it doesn't help you, right? You got to have the logistics. So there were a lot of extensive investments from corporations, from governments, and that's still going on. There you'll see like the port of Singapore, which is a very busy port, and yet the government there is still plowing more money into refurbing that, expanding that, adding to that port, and billions of dollars. So that needs to be done in a lot of places in the United States for us to keep up. But I gave you the example of the 2 ports here in the Los Angeles area. One is owned and operated by the city of Long Beach. The other one is owned and operated by the city of Los Angeles. So they are not state ports. They are not, and much less federal entities. So in order to grow them, expand them, upgrade them, all that falls on the ownership, which is those two cities. And they don't even do things in tandem all the time. So it's a different kind of model that we have here in the United States than in other places. So that means that's a little tricky. But we've seen a lot of third-party logistics companies kind of sprout up from everywhere. First, it was the 3PL. Now we have 4PLs, 5PLs, and they're going all over the place doing all kinds of things for you. And inexpensive shipping. So we had some shipping originally was pretty expensive, and it's still expensive to ship things via air from Asia to the US. But the containers on the boats can be very inexpensive on a per unit cost. They take longer, but there's a lot of different things going on there. The communication has changed a lot. English language is pretty much the default. They're teaching English all over the world in every country, and they're changing the way they teach that. When I started doing business in China, there were a lot of people who understood English, but their conversational English was not so great. And sometimes we even used translators. And this was in the late 90s, early 2000s. Today, they're teaching English in a lot of Chinese schools, and they're teaching conversational English from very young ages, like as young as preschool, kind of 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds. And they're teaching more conversation than grammar and reading. So that's coming later in their curriculum. I worked for HP, and I was doing some business in Germany, and inside the plant, the default language was English. And I happened to be working with a gentleman. He had 2 kids that were teenagers, and he had 2 that were like under 5. And so he said the teenagers, had started English pretty early, but they started with, and English is a Germanic language. So there's a lot of crossover there, and it's a lot easier to learn than, say, some of the Asian languages. But his older children had been taught to read, and then to the grammar and things, not much conversation. The younger one, again, at ages 3, 4, and 5 in Germany were being taught the conversation, and then they waited to teach them. They learned reading along with the other reading, and then the grammar they learned with advanced kinds of classes in elementary school. So a lot of different ways to do that. Well, one of the silver linings of the pandemic is the fact that we have Zoom and webcams and do these conference calls. I did conference calls for years because I worked in these international companies, but they were not near as friendly as all of the technology we have today, whether it's Teams or Zoom or whatever, Google Meets, all of these things are very easy. And the infrastructure, which kept a lot of places from developing as quickly because they needed phone lines, they still needed electrical, water, utilities, but the phone lines were critical. Now everything's done with cellular phones, the mobile phones. You still need the gas, you still need the electricity, maybe natural gas, you still need water, clean water to factories and everything, but you don't need you need a cell tower that's close, and then you can do a lot of things with that. So things are changing a lot. Some of the challenges that we've seen in these kind of morphing is the automation has greatly reduced a lot of the labor cost and the proportion of labor overall in the cost model. If you think about a typical cost model, you've got direct labor, direct material, you've got material overhead, your labor overhead, your G&A, and then your profit. So anytime you can reduce the labor, then that was a good thing. But labor used to be 60, 70% of the cost. Now it's not uncommon to see direct material costs of the direct cost to be the 70, 80%, and then the direct labor down to 20%. So if you can keep models like that, then overall your prices will stay down. The total cost, what we didn't anticipate and what some companies were surprised, unpleasantly surprised, my friends in accounting and finance, when, oh yeah, we're going to outsource this, we're going to save all this money, the price is going down, that's great. And then all of a sudden we started buying things, and the first month that stuff was ready to ship and it got on a boat, or it went to a port, say Shanghai or Hong Kong or Singapore, and then it was on the water for 5-6 weeks, and it took longer. All of a sudden the inventory balances were skyrocketing, because the inventory often transferred ownership at the port, and it does this for many countries, or for many companies in these countries. But the inventory ownership changes at the port of where it leaves Asia. So it becomes, General Motors inventory when it leaves that dock in Hong Kong. And so their inventory balances went through the roof. And so that changed a lot of things, and a lot of costs that expected to be saved were offset by these increased inventory balances. Fluctuating fuel prices has always driven us all crazy. So that doesn't change, and that's still going on. Lead times too have increased, and that freaked a lot of companies out in a lot of ways, because you could get something here in the United States 3, 4, 6 week lead time, and all of a sudden those lead times went to 12, 14, 16, as much as 6-month and 9-month lead times, and then add the pandemic into that. And it's not uncommon today to see things that have the lead time quoted at 50 or 60 weeks, so a year or more. So that's difficult. That's hard to manage. It's hard to predict, and it's hard to manage a lot of the changes and the fluctuations if it's volatile. What we do find, though, is material costs are fairly flat. They do not vary as much as labor rates or anything else around the globe. So there are some differences in material, but not to the extent that labor rates change. And then anytime you have to expedite, it's costly. So if you do a lot of stuff in Asia and you have to expedite anything, you're going to pay through the nose to do that. The politics just goes on and on and on. There's trade agreement changes. They talk about tariffs and, who pays the tariffs and all of this. So most people in the ISM world know that tariffs are typically paid by the importer of record. So that's the company importing it. It's very unusual to have the tariff paid by the exporter. So the exporter gets their price, they do what the customer tells them to do, and then when it shows up at the dock, the tariffs are often paid by the importer of record, which means that the manufacturer of that product in China is not paying those tariffs. It's you and me buying those products here in the United States that are having to pay for those tariffs. We know there's a lot of economic uncertainty. I saw some things today. I want to go back and read the headlines that said that the GDP numbers look good and the inflation numbers are looking less onerous. So that's a good thing. COVID wreaked havoc with anything and everything. And I saw a headline, another headline I want to go back and read, that says that there's another COVID surge expected for late this summer because it's not gone. We see conflicting goals all over the place between the governments, between the different countries, between the different companies. And there's still been this huge rapid growth of manufacturing in China. Like I say, the China manufacturing, it was in Asia and it was going and whatever, but it really exploded in the early 2000s. So, but here's some of the changes. This chart shows annual wages going up about threefold since 2010. And in some areas, wages are up to 8 times the levels from 2000. One study I looked at showed an average monthly rate for a worker of $83 US dollars in June of 2000, and a high of $13.93 in December of 2021. That's almost 17 times higher. So it's gone down again since the 2021, but from $83 a month to almost $1,400 a month is crazy. And so, these wage increases aren't unusual as the countries develop and they create a bigger workforce, the wages go up, and that's going to be repeated again. So that's why China's not as cheap as it was. I have a colleague that works in the apparel business, and they had a lot of their products being produced in China. And she she called and said, Jane, we need help. China is way too expensive. We're going to have to move our production. They were moving it to Bangladesh. They said they looked at Vietnam and Bangladesh and one other country, and they picked at Bangladesh because the labor rates. But when China gets too expensive, then there's some different kinds of things going on. So you're going to see more of that over the next few years, I think. Here's the population. This was done in May. So again, it shows that India passed China as the most populous nation, and there's United States up at the top. So 17.85 and 17.81. So 17 and 17 is 34 and 35%. So it's rapidly growing with India and China, over 35% of the world's population. And then here comes the United States in third place at 4.25%. Doesn't even hold a candle to that. There's 13 countries with over 100 million people. Vietnam is going to reach that milestone soon. They may have already, because I think this is back in June that I did this, 6, maybe 8 weeks ago. And by comparison, the UK has 67 million, which is 0.85% of the world's population. That's down there at the bottom in case you can't find it. But but they have a lot more clout than that. So it's a very imbalanced world when you look at dollars to spend, average wages and things like that versus the number of people you have. So a lot of things going on. And then this is from a capitalistic perspective, that the markets in are in China and India, and they make up 35% of the world's population. So again, and it's actually that 35% is actually down a bit from the 1990s. And if you remember, China took some extreme measures for a while to only allow one child. And if you had two, you were penalized unless you got twins, which was a bonus. China's growth has slowed, but India's hasn't. And you can see that the China is in the red line, and if it's hard to read, India is in the green line. So China was way ahead of India, but they slowed their growth rate. India's has just kind of gone on just as fast as possible. So, where we go from here, I don't know. The United States population has grown, but, not too terribly. We were under 200 million in 1950, and then it just keeps kind of going. So Russia and Germany still about the same levels. And then with 8 billion people now, this chart shows a projection of 9 billion people on the planet by 2040. So that's in the next just about 15 years, 17, 16 and a half, depending on how you do the math. That's a 10 to 12% growth over the next 15 years, if you say. And then they're going to hit another 10 billion, another billion on top of that to hit 10 billion by about 2060. And then they expect it to level off. So who knows? 2060 is a long way away. And I don't know how much of this I'm going to live to see, but it's things to think about when you're thinking about your business, your growth, and what you're trying to do and what you're trying to manage. So I'm going to run through some of this kind of quick, but there's significant resources that are only found in certain places. As we know, not everything is found everywhere in the world, and this has driven a lot of these webs that we've created in supply chains around the world. So Russia has a lot of gold, diamonds, platinum, and other metals, tungsten, palladium, chromium. So some of this is the palladium, I believe, is one of the ones in the catalytic converters that are often stolen off of cars. Titanium for years has been used in aerospace. So anytime if you want to put something in the air, if you can make it out of titanium, it's a whole lot lighter than steel, and it's a lot stronger than aluminum. So titanium's a good thing to have, but Russia's got a lot of deposits. Ukraine has similar resources: coal, iron, graphite, nickel, which is a big deal. And to make different grades of steel, you need different types of nickel. titanium there too, mercury, a lot of timber in Ukraine, sunflower oil. And when Russia first invaded Ukraine, I thought sunflower oil, that doesn't much matter. But guess what? Go look at some of the things in your pantry. If you like potato chips, if you like any kind of chips like that, crackers, you'll find cereals, you'll find a lot of sunflower oil. So a lot of that comes from the Ukraine. They're the biggest sunflower oil producer in the world, or they were. I don't know where they are now, with having had the crap beat out of them for about the last 18 months. Taiwan, coal, copper, gold, and marble. So there's a lot of marble that's been coming from Taiwan. We think about the Carrara marble in Italy, but marble in Taiwan is significantly cheaper, but it's good quality, and it's sold for a lot of construction kind of things. China, lithium, nickel, aluminum, copper. If you don't know, China took over steel production. Pittsburgh used to be the steel capital of the world, hence the Pittsburgh Steelers. But today the production of steel in and around that area is minuscule as compared to what it was 40, 50 years ago. And China's taken over so much of that much of the world is dependent on China for all kinds of steel and aluminum products. And the coils of steel and aluminum come from there. Significant exports. It's been in the news this week. Russia and Ukraine together were producing about 1/3 of the world's wheat. And Russia's now getting out of that grain agreement, and they don't want to play in that space anymore. And third world countries are really feeling that. Here in the United States, we grow a lot of our own grains and we export, but not to the extent that Russia and Ukraine did, and sell that to third world countries who really need that, those products. So that's a big deal. Petroleum products out of Russia, although not into the United States in great numbers. Rolled steel, though, however, was a bigger one. Seed oils, from Ukraine, wheat, corn, all that kind of thing. Taiwan, electronics, whatever. If you don't know, the 60 to 65% of the world's semiconductors and over 90% of the most advanced semiconductor chips come from Taiwan company, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC. And Taiwan's also the 13th largest steel exporter. So there's a lot of things going on there. China, they talk about broadcast equipment, which is a lot of electronics, and tons of computers and screens and speakers and microphones, and a lot of that kind of thing comes from China, is made in different places. Foxconn, which is one of the biggest, if not the biggest company in the world in terms of employees, they have like over 1 million employees, well over 1 million. I think they have 1 million in China alone, but they have lots and lots of factories in China, and they make things for Apple and Samsung and Amazon and lots of other companies. They are a Taiwanese company, but they have lots and lots of presence in China. So that's an interesting model. And China's getting heavy into the car business as well. So there's Foxconn, 1.3 people. They make stuff for all of that. And then TSMC that I just told you about, a big player in that market. And to catch up with that, when you think about 60% of the chip market and 90% of the advanced chips, you're not going to replace that easily. So when you say, I don't care if China invades Taiwan, you need to think about, where do your electronics come from? What are you dependent on? How is this all fit in together? So this network that we have allowed to kind of evolve is very, very complex and convoluted. For companies that are countries that export to the US, here's some of these things that we get. From China, again, electrical, we get a lot of furniture, prefab buildings, a lot of plastics come from there. A lot of toys, games, sports equipment comes from China. From Taiwan, electronics, like I just said, these chips, but they also a lot of plastic and rubber parts. A lot of chemicals come from Taiwan, and machinery itself comes from there. From Russia into the US, copper, rubber, base metals, and palladium, titanium, all these things that I mentioned. And then from the Ukraine, ceramics, a lot of food, the sunflower oil. But another thing that Ukraine had that I was not aware of was a lot of service industries in terms of um, things like call centers. A lot of companies had set up call centers with people, with companies in locations in Ukraine because of the time zone alignment with Europe, and also because they were teaching English well and they had a good educated workforce there. So that's been impacted by this recent invasion of Ukraine. So we say, okay, we don't like where it is now because we know we've got this big web of things all over the country, all over the world, all over the globe. So what do we do? So here's some of the options that companies have. They can do what's called friendshoring, which is moving from, say, China, which is one of the big bad boogeymen right now, to, quote, friendlier venues. But it's not always easy to get out of China. What companies are finding is, yes, so companies bought tools, they bought equipment, they shipped it to China. It's owned by the company that runs the factory. But guess what? You can't just pick it up and move it all the time out of the country, because in order to ship some of that equipment, machinery, factories, you need certain permits, you need to be certain things with the government to get permission to move it. Even if it's your company's tools and equipment, that China has been lately clamping down on that and saying, no, you can't take that out of the country. Now you can take it from one city to another if you want to move it, but you can't take it out of China. Also in China, and we know this has happened a lot in Europe with employment contracts. What recently a company was trying to shut down their factory in China and just close it up and move all the things somewhere else. They found the workers came and said, well, you owe us 2 years worth of worth of salaries if you're going to close this down and put us out of work. And they said, what do you mean? And they said, well, these are the conditions for doing business here. And the workers actually kind of kidnapped in place the general manager. They locked him in his office. They fed him and, didn't torture him, but he was not allowed to leave until he agreed to pay that. So there's a lot of things that companies are finding that, whoa, I just can't pick up and move out of China. It was much easier to pick up and move into China than it may be to move out. And even if you can move, it takes time and money to do that. You might have to replace equipment, you might have to replace tools, you might have to do build up inventory in one place as you move equipment and get it ramped up in another. So there's a lot of challenges for that. So that friendshoring, moving it from China to a friendlier organization, may be a good option, may not. If you do that, there's reshoring, which is returning it to the United States, which might be in-house, or it still might be outsourced. So if your company is here in California, you might bring something into Texas or Alabama, into a supplier that's in that area. It's reshored because it's not in China anymore, but it's still outsourced. That's options companies are looking at. They're looking at dual sourcing. So if you have significant volumes, you might be able to just decide to bring up a dual source and select another supplier, start ramping them up while you ramp the other one down, or at least balance that out a little bit. But if your volumes are pretty small, that's a very expensive proposition and it might not work for you. And then some companies are doing the status quo, or what I say might be an ostrich approach, and that's just put your head in the sand and hope that it's going to get better on its own. Whichever of these works for your company, it's going to vary all over the place. So you can't let somebody else tell you what to do with your business. So here's just, this is too many words, but I'm just going to tell you about some of the other countries real quick that companies are going to. Malaysia, which has the third largest economy in Southeast Asia. India is viewed as a China alternate because of the large labor force, the skilled workers, and they speak English. Thailand, second largest hard disk drive producer, which is interesting, and they do a lot of computer components. So this chart has pros and cons for each, and you can look at that at your time. If you want the slides, I'm happy to share these with you. Indonesia, fourth in the world's population, which it blows a lot of people away, but they've had an agricultural focus until recently. So they're up and coming. Vietnam, U.S. imports rose 40% in Q1 of 2019. That's growing the economy. A lot of companies are now moving into Vietnam, but there's still challenges with that. And then Mexico. Mexico has been hot and then not so hot, and now it's back hot again. So companies are looking at those as alternatives. And again, this chart shows some pros and cons for each. So our company is doing this. And if you look at some of the stories on this, the articles, some places say, yeah, it's going great. Other places say, there's hardly any movement. So a lot of it depends on the industry, how quick you want to do it and whatever. But infrastructure is a challenge. Export of components. Companies are exporting components and assembling somewhere else. So they might be moving the assembly part and leaving the production of the components in one place. Some companies are embracing this trend of reshoring and doing some things. Some companies are not. But it's potentially expensive because you can lose your tools. You always have the risk to intellectual property. The communication is tough, and it requires a lot of project management and a lot of resources to do this kind of stuff. So as always, there's a better way. Supply chain architectures weren't designed. So anybody that tells you differently, look at just what's happened. And some of this was by design, and a lot of it was chasing these different goals that ended up being, where we are today. So there's a lot of ways to do that, but they are complicated. Circumstances change. They've changed since they started, and they will continue to change. So labor content, wages, the politics of all of it, the demand changes, the technology changes, infrastructures change. Once it's established, it takes time and dollars to change it. So it doesn't get flipped overnight. Don't underestimate these complex relationships, because they are complex. Companies went to China not just for cheap labor, but for access to markets. You take away the production that you do there, and sometimes the Chinese government is not as friendly for you to sell your products into there. And I'm just picking on China, but any of these countries anywhere around the world have the same kind of thing. They want to sell your products, but they also want to have local jobs from that. So there's a lot of that. So change is the only constant. We've woven a really tangled web. If you need help untangling yours, companies like me and myself at purplelink are happy to help you look at alternatives and evaluate what you can do. So we got just a couple minutes left. I'll take some questions. And if you, this says PMI webinar, but you need to put ISM webinar in it. So if you give you last 30 seconds to join in the raffle. If you want to be part of the raffle, send me an email to jane@purplelink.co, and in the subject put ISM or webinar or something like that. And I'm going to wait for this to refresh here, and then I'm going to use this fancy little thing on my phone, which is a random number generator, and I'll pick a winner for that. If you like the slides, again, send me the email. I will give you today's slides. You'll get a copy of those, and you'll get enrolled for my dynamic dialogue webinars, which I think Kathy said are bi-monthly, but they're only once a month. I'm doing those once a month. So we restarted that in July. I had the first one this week. They're the fourth Thursday of the month, and we'll go through the end of the year. So about 10 more seconds. Let's see, questions, if I see any questions. Play safeguard to source within the country. Yeah, it's good to source within the country. It's also good to dual source, where you can get some advantages from being outside of the country. The reduces conversation cycle times, lead times, cash flow, all of that. Again, but where are your markets and what are you trying to do? Infrastructure, not mentioned as a con in regards to nearshoring to Mexico. In some places, it's quite a con. In other places, it's not so much. So again, I got a couple of these coming in, so I'm just going to wait another 10 minutes. And Kathy just put my email again back in that. So here's my, I'm counting now the people who want to be included. And let me use this random number generator. Okay, and the winner is going to be, and you have to be here to win. Laura Hallstatt. Are you still on, Laura?
Yes, she is.
If she is, I don't know what email you use, Laura, but if you use like a business email and you want me to, because I'm going to send you an Amazon gift card by email. If you want me to send it to a personal email, just email me again with that personal email and I'll get that sent out to you. And then the rest of you who gave me your information, I will send out the slides and enroll you. And Kathy will send out a link to this as well. I think later today or tomorrow. Kathy is usually your thing, right?
Yeah, definitely. Try to do it today if I can, everybody.
Yeah. And then here's my last slide for you. So I like this because there's a lot of people sitting at the table and you can tell that these are great deep thinkers, right? Behind them are their charts, because we always have charts, profits and sales, and they're both going down kind of in the toilet. And some bright person says, well, what if we don't change it all and something magical just happens? So some companies kind of seem to do that. And I happen to believe in magic and miracles and things like that, but they don't always just happen. So sometimes you have to actually help them along and make some choices. So if you're in this business and you're doing things, think about some of these ramifications. Always look at the history and figure out where you want to go. And if you need help, there is help available. So that's what I have. And if nothing else, Kathy, I'll turn it back to you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Jane. Always a great presentation that you always give us on a variety of topics. And I'm so happy that we had quite a few people join us today. And at this time, I'm going to close out the program. Just a lot of nice comments, Jane. Nice job. Very informative, as always. So thank you, Jane. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll be getting the email out to you, and we'll be sending the recording as well, as Jane mentioned. Thank you all. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Kathy.